history to start with. We're going to be talking about the sweet slaves of St John.
Evening. Right. Don't want to be without my drink. Yes, the Sweet Slaves of St John. So that's a quite interesting title that I've picked for myself. What I'm really looking at is the use of slaves by the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights of St John, the Knights of Malta, this group of knights, this military order, who are still around today. The existence of military orders today is often quite surprising. You don't think of World War I, the Teutonic Knights were there fighting, or the Hospitallers are still on Malta and are currently larger than they've ever been in terms of how many people they've got in the order. Or the Knights of St Lazarus are fighting leprosy as they were during the First Crusade, and they have a commandery in Cardiff. Yeah, but focusing on my actual Hospitallers for a second. So what I'm looking at is to try and define, I'm trying to do a bit of context, explain what I'm really talking about. So military orders are this group of people, well, they used to be this group of people who were kind of monks, kind of warriors. They took religious vows, but they also really liked to stab people. I'm sure most of you are aware of the most famous military order, the Templars. You know, the good guys in the Da Vinci Code, the bad guys in Assassin's Creed, the massive racists in that film Kingdom of Heaven. And so the Knights Hospitaller are basically another military order. These guys are all formed in the wake of the First Crusade because all the Crusaders went home and there's no one to defend Jerusalem anymore. So they suckered in some knights who felt bad about being knights and told them that if they swore some vows of chastity, it'd all be fine. Except for those that didn't, but that's also fine. And the whole evolution of their use of slaves happens quite gradually because they keep being given stuff. So they get given these castles. You can look after that. I'm going to look after that. You look after that. So the King of Jerusalem will give the Templars a castle, give the Hospitallers a castle. And then they go, well, you can't just have a castle. You need some fields. You need some people to feed you while you're defending it. And so suddenly they've got villagers. They've got peasants. And then the frontier moves. And suddenly you've got this bit of land where you don't actually have to fight to defend it. You've just got some land. It's your land. You don't need to garrison it suddenly. So you can start using it productively. You can start growing things, which is where the sweet slaves of St John come in, because it's to do with the cultivation of sugar. Because sugar in the Holy Land was slowly developing, but the Crusaders show up and go, this stuff's pretty good, you know, this sugar stuff. And the Hospitallers, specifically, they're a medical order. So they deal with sick pilgrims, is how they started. The whole fighting thing, that's a sideline. Except for when it's not. It's actually what they really do. But they're also still looking after sick pilgrims. And they start cultivating sugar for medicine. So a spoonful of sugar, as far as a sick pilgrim is concerned, is like a miracle on a plate. They're full of energy, they bounce around. And somehow the idea gets out in Western Europe that it might be a cure for plague. It's not a cure for plague, it's sugar. But they buy large quantities of it and it becomes a real cash crop. Now, I'm talking about this group, I'm actually talking about 800 years of history. So the First Crusade is in 1091 and the Hospitallers are set up around the year 1000. Now, in the year 1800, they have Caribbean islands. They are out there in the New World owning Caribbean islands and setting up sugar plantations. It doesn't go very well for them as a result of several plagues, so they don't turn up in the history books very often. But you have this line that stretches from the medieval Crusade period all the way up to New World slavery. And these people on these plantations don't typically want to be there. Sugar is a very labour-intensive crop, and a lot of these lands the Hospitallers are given don't tend to come with people because they've just been captured in battle. So you have to get the people yourself. And what's really interesting, the significance, why am I bothering with all this? It's all very fascinating, but it's about conceptions of slavery. So at one end, you have New World slavery. And, you know, we've all kind of seen Roots. We know what slavery is supposed to look like. And that's what's going on at that end. You've got this very racialized New World slave trade. And that's kind of the New World aspect of it, and that's what the Hospitaller is getting up to. But in the Crusader period, that's not true at all. This slavery isn't racialized, it's barely religious. Like, the Hospitallers actually own Christians, because it's better that we own them rather than they be owned by Saracens, because that would be terrible. The concept of freeing this people, that's not there. There's none of this, we could free them. No, we'll buy the Christian slaves and keep them ourselves. So the issue isn't, this Christian, religious, very holy order is using slaves, doesn't have any problem with slaves. And the income from sugar isn't some small amount. By the 14th, 15th century, you're talking about 20% of the order's income comes from sugar plantations on Cyprus. They're producing tons and tons of sugar. They've got about 1,500 people enslaved on plantations, which isn't a small figure. But what's key to this research is the fact this line from the Crusader era up to the modern era. Because New World slavery is very often seen as this isolated event, this terrible thing that happened and had no precursors. But then you go back and go, well, this is 14th century Cyprus, and they've got sugar plantations. This is just outside of Jerusalem, and they've got sugar plantations in the 12th century. And they've actually got these farms. They're developing new innovations, new technology, grinding methods to produce better qualities of sugar. That seems as if it should somehow fit into the New World history. This kind of colonial expansion that came from the Western powers has its roots in the Crusader era. And the reason I'm going into this is because a lot of the history of the Crusades has forgotten about this. It's been quite positively ignored. Crusade historians very often talk about captives or prisoners, these people that they were just keeping them. They were going to ransom them eventually in a couple generations. Just when they got round to it, there was this one argument that went, the Hospitallers only captured people to exchange them for Christian captives. And that happened occasionally, but you don't capture 1,000 people for a couple of captives. So the significance of this all kind of fits into conceptions of slavery. And it actually has some quite interesting links to modern day slavery, because the New World slave system has been held as the slave system. In the history of slavery, there is Roman slavery and New World slavery, and they are held as different points of the spectrum. This medieval slavery has a bit of both going on. Like, if you wanted to free a Hospitaller slave, and it happened, they freed their slaves for various reasons, the actual document says they regain the rights of a Roman citizen, despite the fact there's no Rome. There hasn't been a Rome for hundreds of years. But they never bothered changing the documents. They've just been using the same document that grants freedom the whole time. So, overall, I'm looking into this use of slaves, and it's not just sugar, but that's the most key one because of the whole New World thing. It's also rowers, domestic slaves, things of that nature. And overall, this research is significant for defining New World slavery, for putting medieval slavery in context, but for also showing the extent to which the Crusades have been forgotten about by current history. The darker side of the Crusades that is often lost in all that religious zeal and racism. Which I understand that's not a lighter side of the Crusades, but it is important to understand within conceptions of slavery that the idea that it disappears within the medieval context have been greatly exaggerated. So that is why I'm studying the sweet slaves of St. John. Sorry. I want to get back to my drink.
I have to run Any questions?
Right.
When you talk about the slaves, were they rural slaves?
Yes and no. It depends on what you're talking about. The treatment of slaves actually evolves over the period. In the Crusader period, they tend to be bringing slaves in and putting them into existing peasant communities, serf communities, as additional labour for this new boom industry. And they're quite nice to them. They tend to get families, they have liberties, they're in a rural setting, they're not exactly fenced in. Whereas, as a result of basically how the Crusades go, they lose the Holy Land, they lose Cyprus, the Hospitallers end up on Malta, and they take 2,000 slaves with them. And these slaves are far more mistreated. Now, I haven't really gone into much detail in my research yet about as to when that switch happened, but these slaves are living in basically prisons. You bring them out when you want them to row your galley or do some work, and then you lock them up again. And you get far more slave rebellions, you get far more uprisings. And when that change occurs, I'm not entirely sure of yet, but it is significant because the Hospitallers start treating slaves as you would expect in the New World. They start being harsher and crueler to them. And the slaves have uprisings. They're not exactly happy with this situation. Whereas in the earlier time, they seem to be not exactly content, but less likely to try and murder everyone in the night.
I was just trying to, in terms of geography, you said it was Western Europe, they went to Cyprus.
Yep.
And what, these are black, where the slaves, where did they get them from, where, what?
Well, that's kind of my point, is the Crusader slavery wasn't racialised, it was whoever was about. So they're enslaving local Greeks, they're enslaving Saracens from the Holy Land. The documents do mention a few black slaves that have been brought, but they tend to be rarer. They get a lot of Russians, whoever they can basically get their hands on. But a lot of Saracens, Middle Eastern, Muslims, people that they've defeated in battle. There tends to be a lot of people who they capture from naval combat, because in the later Crusades, after they've lost the Holy Land, it becomes very naval, the combat, and the Hospitallers get quite good at that. So that's how they tend to win people, is they'll capture a shitload of Ottomans, and they'll bring them to the island.
That's not what really your interest is, but that may explain to some extent why the separation then,
Yes.
in terms of the discussion of New World Slavery.
Yeah.
Nothing more about that word anyway. And from that period,
Yeah.
I say that there isn't the connection or the taste then for that kind of a system, but that may explain the
Yeah, there are reasons why there's been a separation between them, but it's kind of looking at how New World slavery, instead of it miraculously appearing, there's an actual evolution. So Spain starts experimenting with slavery. People start dabbling with slavery during the Crusader period, and large-scale slavery, for like industrial-scale slavery, before they even start going towards importing large numbers of people. Because Spain's got a frontier, they can take the Muslim invaders and enslave them, and so you get these precursors to New World slavery that are kind of hints at what's to come, sort of thing, that has been ignored.
Really interesting. What do you have any records or any sources that speak about white slaves? And I use the word white to point to the racialization. White slaves in the New World. At that specific period.
At that specific period, so far, I haven't. One of the main characteristics of the New World slavery is the reason it became so racial is quite often there was this indentured white labour, these people who were forced to go, deported, who very much wanted to define themselves against someone else. They wanted to go, well, at least we're not as bad a position as X. And so if you look at the people who went to the New World, it's something like 80% didn't go voluntarily. They were forced to go. And that counts everyone, like white, black, the racial thing. But a lot of the racial characteristics of slavery at that era tend to evolve as a result of slightly less enslaved groups trying to define themselves, serfs, sort of. So like English, Western European serfs trying to define themselves against a more unfree group. So they are actually very keen to show themselves to not be slaves at that period. For the earlier periods, white slaves, there are lots of documents of them.